Full disclosure, there's a lot of work that needs to happen around this property. Updating the air conditioner is one. Here's a look at the existing condenser. While it is in working condition, it's old, it's brittle, and even the cable is starting to deteriorate. And this area probably seen better days. The air handler is inside the garage, up in the ceiling. It looks like a pretty solid install from my little knowledge of HVAC systems. The ductwork has been slowly coming apart for years. This unit is almost 20 years old, which I think it's pretty good. In my eyes, it's done its duty and it's time to move on. The stars aligned and I'm partnering up with Senville to install one of their newest systems. The unit showed up in 3 different boxes on a pallet. Inside box number 1, I have this 50-foot roll of line set. The lines already have the nuts on them, but I'll touch more on that later. And inside this box, there are a few more items to help you complete the installation. As I unbox the outdoor unit, you'll see it's pretty sleek compared to the previous unit. This is a 4-ton condenser, so it's quite large and there's nothing abnormal about it. However, if you compare it to the Senville outdoor unit, you'll see the new unit is much slimmer and a bit taller. The outdoor unit also comes with additional accessories, like the drain hose, adapters to connect to the existing line, along with these rubber pads to place underneath the feet. And in box number 3, we have the air handler. And tucked inside, there's another box of accessories. There's a portable remote, vibration pads, a wired controller, aka thermostat, and there's also some additional connectors on the inside to connect to the set line. Both the old unit and the new unit air handler looks very similar. The only difference was the length of them. The new one was a bit shorter by 3 inches. I will be replacing my perfectly fine AC unit. That said, it's 19 years old. I think it's best to give up on it before it gives up on me. And the best part, I'm gonna do it with no prior experience. Before I decided to do this, I tried to get help from local AC companies, but unfortunately, none of them wanted me to be a part of the process. Even though I was willing to pay for the full installation, I just wanted to be a helper. So after weeks of trying, I decided to give up and go a different route. And after racking my brain, it hit me. I could just hire an AC company on a regular service call, ask them to come out and remove the refrigerant from the line, which would allow me to have the opportunity to safely work on the system and then figure out the rest of it later. It was at that moment where I felt like I could do this. I simply contact a local company and asked, could they just come out and disconnect the line? I was told that this was an odd request, but it could be done.
So it's all the refrigerants pumped back into the compressor here.
Is that why I shut down?
I shut it down.
Oh, you shut it down.
Yeah.
Gotcha. As a kid, I was pretty good at tearing things apart, so this should be no different. Putting it back together, we'll see about that. The compressor has all the refrigerant stored inside, so I do have to be careful with my handling of the condenser. By the way, this slab isn't big enough for my liking, so I'm gonna get rid of it. The next time you see a slab here, it's gonna be just a little bit bigger. But no worries, I did film that. It's just not gonna be part of this video. It'll be one coming up soon. Before I remove the indoor unit, I'm gonna make sure the breaker is off. I tend to look at things in layers, so that's how I will approach this. First, I'm gonna remove the drain pan. Since I've never done this before, I'm taking mental notes because I want to make sure I see how things are done. After inspecting this, I noticed there was a small piece of ductwork in between the air handler and the ductwork coming out of the wall. To minimize any possible damage, I tried to be careful as possible to cut right on the seam. Right after, I'll remove the two panels so I can get access to the electrical wires and the low voltage wires. I gave the unit a little nudge and I realized it was pretty heavy. I didn't want to take any chances. I thought the best thing to do was to dismantle it by removing the heavy components. Removing the fan should definitely make this unit lighter. I disconnected the copper lines from the coil and then I pulled the coil out. Now that I've shed some weight from this is much more manageable. I can take this box down and get it out of my way. Replacing the set line is going to be one of the more complicated part of this entire process, and that's because of what I have to deal with on the outside and also within the attic. The ductwork is in the way and I'm making a decision that I want to replace it. In my case, I just wanted to get rid of a 20-year-old line and just put in a new one. This was an original install which was done during the construction, and that's quite clear because the cover was pretty much stuccoed in. I've had this chisel for years, which I've done a lot of tough stuff with it. For whatever reason, I decided I was going to chisel this entire cover off. And it was working just fine, but I noticed I started to disturb the stucco too much. So I grabbed a grinder and do what most people would have done from the start and try to cut it off this way. An HVAC guy would have likely left the line in place, soldered onto it, and moved along. But I'm not an HVAC guy, right? The refrigerant lines is not the only reason I was cutting this off. I also needed to get some new wires here. Removing the cover was not easy, but I was determined. Removing the older lines was more challenging than I thought. I thought I had enough angle to pull this out, but there were some things that I just couldn't see. I ended up cutting the lines into a few sections, which was much more manageable. After some extra tugging, I finally got it out. The old line is out and it's time to get the new one in. Aside from the line set, I'm bringing two wires to the unit. One wire is for communication, the other wire is for 24-volt thermostats. To my understanding, you can get the set lines in two different lengths. More options may become available, but for right now there's 16 foot and 50 foot. 16 foot was too short, so I opted to get the 50. Once I started to unspool this, I realized this was way longer than I need. With that in mind, I thought, well, I'll figure this out. So I taped the wires onto the lines and proceed to push this up into the attic. Before I proceed, this is a two-person's job, even though I was trying to do it myself. I started to feed the line up, but from my point of view, I was unable to see the challenges that I was facing. I got about 18 foot of the line into the attic before things got extremely challenging. I screwed up here. I needed help to feed the set lines through the attic. I also should have went a step further and removed part of the soffit so I could get a better visual of what I'm doing. Long story short, I put a serious bend in the 3/4 pipe. To begin, the lines were completely too long. I needed about 25 foot, but the lines were 50 foot. But no effort is worth this. I did learn something in the process. Even though I had 50 foot of line to work with, it was solid copper all the way through. I could have cut the line and just put on new fittings, but keep in mind, at this moment, I lacked the experience and I didn't have the tools to do so. But in the end, failure is not always a bad thing. It's a great opportunity to learn some things that you shouldn't do. While being in this position, it was a little nerve-wracking, but now I get the opportunity to learn how to make up my own lines. To avoid lengthy wait time trying to order a new line, I decided to check the specs on the line. I went to a local HVAC distributor got the proper line, came back, and went to work. So I'm still working alone, but this time around, I'm opening up the soffit so I can get a better angle on feeding the pipe up. The issues I ran into was mostly because I was working alone and a second set of hand would be extremely helpful. This time around, I pulled the pipe separately and then the wires separately. This way I can only focus on one thing at a time. I'm preparing the new cover for installation. The previous one was 4-inch wide and this one is 5 inches, so just a little bit bigger. I realized there were no holes in this cover, so I selected a few spots and drilled them where I thought they made sense. Before putting the cover on, I strapped the wires to the refrigerant line to keep them out the way. I held the cover in place and used a masonry bit to drill the holes into the wall. Then I secured it with Tapcons. Once I drill the final hole, I'll tighten all the screws up and then pivot to the inside. In order to install the air handler, I have to fill the open space between the air handler and the ductwork coming out the wall. If you're unfamiliar with this large panel I'm cutting is a duct board. This is not something I would recommend buying off the internet. Maybe find a local HVAC distributor near you. It was much cheaper. I don't have any experience working with this, but hang tight, you'll see how I made it work. I needed about 14 inches to fill the gap between the old ductwork and the air handler. So to give myself room for any possible mistake, instead of the 14 inches I needed, I cut off an 18-inch section. That way I have some room for mistakes. Now I had to buy some additional tools to do this job, but I'll link everything down in the video description. So I've cut away what I needed and now I can get this out of my way. Taking on projects like this and all the unknowns you might run into can be a little intimidating, but once you do it, your confidence goes through the roof. When I say I don't know what I'm doing, I mean it. I need to make a box, and you can do that in a number of ways. What I'm gonna do here is utilize the old box that was there, a piece of it, and basically copy the same cuts that they had. At this point, I have all the cuts I need to form the box. I do see there's one area I can make some adjustments. Once I did that, I then took it up to the ductwork and see how well it lines up. I don't think I showed it very well, but the two ductwork, once they butt up against each other, it should fit together like a half-lap joint. From what I can see here, everything looked good. So I'm gonna set this off to the side and have a look at the air handler. I'll pull the panel off and have a closer look on the inside. While this may look intimidating, understanding what's happening here is pretty important. The air handler has 3 different compartments. The way I have it standing up now, looking at it from the top, you have the electrical compartment. This is where all the wires routed to, from the electrical to all the other low voltage component. Just below that, you have the fan. And right below that, you have the coil compartment. Out of the box, the system fits my current configuration to a T. Following the instructions in the manual, the coil can be pulled out and repositioned. I'm not gonna say this is dummy proof, but it's quite easy to work on this system because there are labels all over the place that's going to get you accustomed to understanding what's going on here, from the manuals to the door panels to the side of the unit. There are labels all over. Before I get the unit up in the air, I'm going to do some prep work. There are some knockout holes on the panels, but I found them to be very difficult to remove. And I didn't want to bend the panel up, so I stopped. I'm going to use the 3/4 inch hole saw to cut my own holes. I'm going to make 2 holes, one for the high voltage wire going to the electrical panel, and one for the low voltage wires for the thermostats, the communication cable, and the water flow switch. Anytime you're passing wire through metal, you should always sleeve it. It doesn't matter what you use, but this compression fitting I'm using should do just fine. The electrical wire already has a fitting on it, so I'll use that one. So I now need to get the unit up here. I asked a buddy of mine to swing by on his way home from work to help me get the unit up, and he did just that. To get you on the same page as me, very little work has been done inside. The refrigerant line and the low voltage cables are in here, and the air handler is literally just dangling here. Now I'm going to take these little foam pads and stick them on the bottom of the unit to reduce vibration. Now if I was to stick these again, I'd probably bring them about 2 inches in from the edge. Once you adhere them, forget it, they're not coming back off. One thing I wanted to note is I made sure the chain and everything was leveled before I put the unit in place. As I mentioned, the new air handler was a little shorter, so I ended up moving the chain about 3 inches. Now I took the duct board that I made earlier, measured all 4 sides, and cut the ductwork accordingly to fill the gap. I also used a large level, you can use a long piece of wood, to make sure the air handler was as center as possible to the 2 ducts coming out the wall. I'm not sure how an HVAC guy would go about this, but I analyzed my situation and then I put part of the duct board on the top, and now I'm just gonna wrap it all the way around until I can close it. This is quite tedious. It was extremely hot, but it was very fun for me because I was learning something new. Once I got this first section in, I then moved to the other side and repeated the same process. Right where the blower is, there's a little lip sticking off, so I'm going to cut off a section of this just so it fit neatly up in there without any interference. Now that I know the ductwork fits, it's time to seal this up. Now that I have the ductwork sealed, I'll route the wires into the air handler and hook up all the electrical wires. Those make sense to me right off the bat. For the other wires, I'll have to check the manual and hook those up later. This wire needs to be routed into the unit as well, but I'm going to eliminate it and run a new wire from the thermostat back to here. So I'm going to fast forward to the future and I'll show you how I made the hookup. As shown, I have the wires labeled. One goes outdoor, one goes to the thermostat. I do want to hook up my 24 volts Wi-Fi thermostat, so I'm going to leave all this bundle of wire here and address that later. For this video, I'll focus on what comes with the system. These terminals will get connected to the thermostat. You only need 1 wire per terminal, even though I'm showing that I doubled up on them. On the board on the top, there's this terminal block. This is where the water switch will go. Since I will have a float switch connected to the terminal, right beside the block, there's a little jumper that's hidden. That needs to be cut. And right on the top board, this is where I connect the S1 and S2 communication to the outdoor unit. And that's it. This unit comes pressurized from factory. So I was taking my time to loosen it up and hopefully the air could leak out. But I think I went a little too far and it blew the cap off, and even though I knew it was coming, it caught me off guard. While doing this, I learned how to make up my own flare fittings. The unit actually came with the proper size nuts. I was able to utilize those. I'm in a tight spot now, so later on I'll show you how I actually made the flare fittings. Adjusting my camera got a little blurry on me, so what I'm doing here is applying a little bit of liquid sealer, and then I'm gonna take my hand and tighten the nuts on. It's recommended to use a torque wrench, but I basically used a adjustable wrench to tighten it as much as I could without over tightening it. I had to muscle this in place so that it sit properly and without damaging the copper, of course. I'm gonna take this membrane, wrap the ductwork before putting on the sealer. I'm gonna try to do this with one continuous wrap because I don't want anything to come loose. I'm using a water-based mastic here to seal up the ductwork. I laid it on pretty thick, but the next day I noticed some of the membrane was still visible, so I put on a second coat. Now I can't see the interior, but from the outside, I think the ductwork came out pretty good. The older air handler had a 50 amp breaker on it. The new one is only requiring a 15. So I need to snatch out the one that's in place and put in the correct one. While I may feel comfortable working in an electrical panel, I'm still wearing gloves. We're talking about hundreds of amps here. If this is not a comfort zone for you, I highly recommend getting an electrician involved. But if you're gonna do this yourself, work safely, wear gloves, and possibly turn off the entire panel. So I'm simply gonna carefully swap the wire from one breaker to the other. At this point, I'm not gonna test the breaker, I'm gonna leave it off. I'm just gonna trust that I did a good job and wait for the AC guy to come. So it's time to bring out the outdoor unit and put it in place. Sometimes I trust myself a little too much, but it's always best to have help when you're doing these types of things, so my recommendation. The outdoor unit came bolted to a small pallet, which made it helpful to move around, but now it's time to remove it. I had to remove the fan grill to at least get to one of the bolts. The unit is slim and it's designed to take up less space. If needed, the unit can be mounted as little as 12 inches away from the wall. That's not a big concern for me, so I left myself plenty of room so I can do work behind the unit. I'll align the unit to the front of the slab, then I'll mark the mounting holes. And after, I'll use a masonry bit to drill the holes into the slab. The unit comes with this drain joint. It also comes with a drain hose, but I can see that not holding up too long in the Florida sun. I did modify a sprinkler pipe that would fit right onto this. Ultimately, I would have to raise the unit too high to use this setup, so I took it off. To get the unit as level as I could, I used a piece of PVC board along the front to make up for the pitch on the concrete. It could be a hint better, but I can live with this. The way the old unit was installed, there was no disconnect box near the unit. However, there's a breaker box about 8 feet away, which, according to the AC guy that was out, that was sufficient enough. So I'm gonna add a new disconnect within arm's reach. I'm also adding this small junction box here at the bottom. I want to protect the new low voltage wire considering the old one was disintegrated from the outdoor element. Basically, this is just going to be a pass through. I fed the rest of the wire through the pipe going to the outdoor unit and then put the cover on the junction box. I also routed the wire whip from the disconnect box over to the outdoor unit. I crimped on the necessary fittings to the electrical conductors. Then I secured them to the proper terminal. I did the same thing for the S1 and S2 communication bus between the outdoor unit and the indoor unit. The reason why I have two wires here rather than one, the black wire is for the communication bus and the brown thermostat wire is for if you're using 24 volts thermostats. For example, I have a smart thermostat that I was using on the old unit. I may use that later, but I want to make sure that the proprietary one works just fine first. I left the refrigerant line as one of the last things to hook up so I don't have to disturb the unit. Since working with the 3/8 line is a lot easier than working with the 3/4 line, I decided to address that one first. So I'll take the copper cutter and cut off a section. I used a pipe cutter and carefully scored the pipe until I was able to cut it to the proper length. Now I'm going to remove the burr from the interior of the line. Before I lose track of what I'm doing and forget, I'm going to slip the nut on. Now I'll put the flare tool on the pipe in the proper position and go through the process. I think I have a pretty good flare here. This was a bit of a learning curve for me, but I got a pretty good finish on the 3/4 pipe as well. I'm going to remove the existing nuts that came on the unit. These are also nuts that you can reuse. Once I got the 3/8 line into position and I felt like I could make a good connection, I then applied some of the liquid sealer. I put some on the back end of the flare and a little bit along the thread. To avoid cross threading, you should use your hand and tighten this as much as possible. I have one more thing to do here, and that's to extend the drain line to the edge of the concrete slab. So this morning I have the AC guy coming. It is recommended on the system, both indoor and outdoor, that you get a certified technician to come out and start the system up. To avoid any delays, I have everything open for quick access. The outdoor unit requires a minimum of 40 amps, and that's in place. So Mark is here again and he's doing all of his setup. The first thing he did was to put pressure on the line and make sure there was no leak. He's also doing a soap test to make sure there are no issues at the connectors. Also, pretty big relief for me to not see any bubbles forming up at the connection. The indoor connection was tested as well with no issue shown, so far so good. The line's been tested for leaks and that passed. Now it's on to vacuuming.
Should do it pretty quick because it's a short line set.
Yeah.
And it's just the EVAC coil and the line set. Don't get oil or anything in it. I'll let this go for a while, so. Alright, so you're solid.
Looks like we have a green light on everything. All the tests was passed, and since the unit comes pre-charged with the correct gas, all you have to do is open up the valves.
Equalizing out really nice. Let it keep running.
Is it starting to drain yet?
Oh yeah, steady.
With the successful system installed, I can move on to putting on the final touches like wrapping the copper lines up. I sleeve the copper and put black tape on the joints. I reinstalled the drain pan. In an old video of mine, I once showed how to make this contraption. Not identical, but very similar. The idea is to put a cutoff valve in between the drain and the air handler. Once the valve is set to off, I can then pump water through the line and clear it out quickly. Before I glued the parts, I tested the drain, made sure it worked, and then I finalized it. I put a float switch at the unit and also a float switch on the pan. The unit comes with this portable remote so you can adjust the system from your couch or wherever within range. After the system was powered up, we went through a range of testing. We tested the float switch to make sure that shut the system down in case of a clog to prevent any flooding. We also tested the temperature coming out of the unit, which we saw a 20% differential, air going in versus air coming out. We tested the heating and the cooling. There are some things I'm still learning about this system, which is why I don't want to put my thermostat in there just yet. As of now, between the Wi-Fi thermostat I have and this system, I don't know what possible features may or may not work, like the variable fan speeds or the variable modes on the thermostat that came with this system. Going from a person that never installed one of these systems to now having one installed, I'd say there are some things I learned along the way which definitely took away the intimidation of working on a system. I definitely saved a few $1,000s doing this system myself. Outside of materials, I paid a certified tech to come out twice to disconnect the system and inspect and turn the system on. This is how it started, and this is how it's going.